Hello, my name is Katie Bayliss and you're watching the PR Week video podcast produced in association with Marketeers for DC. Well, with the dust now settling after the riots that swept through England and social media being dragged into the headlines, PR Week debates what social media bosses need to do to combat bad press. Today I'm joined by Beth Carroll, Head of Social Media at 3Pipe, and Danny Watmo, Head of Digital PR at EML Wildfire, to see how the PR bosses of Twitter, Facebook and BlackBerry makers Research in Motion can distance their brands away from the riots. Well, firstly, today Twitter, Facebook and BlackBerry makers Research in Motion have been summoned to a meeting at the Home Office. How can they communicate messages of cooperation without alienating their customers?
Well, fundamentally, I think it's a really positive thing that they are willing to cooperate in this way and are willing to meet with them to discuss how to move forwards. Of course, they don't want people inciting hate on their platforms, and that's always going to be a problem. But at the same time, I think there's a real education process for them to go through with the authorities, helping them understand actually that the majority of people are not using social media in that way. The majority of people are being responsible, are taking responsibility for their actions. And I mean, I'm sure a lot of people saw during the riots when there were negative messages posted, they were quickly passed on to the police, and people weren't standing for it, if you like. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think Beth is totally right. I think there's a careful balancing act that these companies now have to do. On the one hand, they want to be seen to be working with the government and stamping out illegal activities where they happen on the platforms they have. But I think they've also got a responsibility to their users to ensure that there isn't more government interference in what are essentially open global communication networks. So it's a careful balancing act there for them, I think.
And it obviously was a lot of bad press during the riots towards social networking, Twitter. How can social media, I guess, on the whole, stand up to the scrutiny and make sure it isn't a scapegoat when events like this happen in the future?
Well, again, I think it is about education and making people aware of how the platforms are used, ensuring that they are acting responsibly all the time, making sure when negative messages are posted they are flagged, and also letting people know that that is happening and that that's not how social media is used by the masses, and most people are very responsible in the way they use the platforms.
Yeah, and I think there is this increasing sense that there is a bit of a demonisation of technology, as Jeff Jarvis has said, and you know, headlines that we saw during the riots from papers like the Daily Mail and the Sun, where they're basically coming out and essentially blaming networks like Twitter and BlackBerry for the riots themselves, just strikes me to be, totally ludicrous, and it's a bit concerning. I think that the government have now taken this on and coming out with this narrative as well.
And how can social media comms professionals put users' fears of monitoring and prosecution to rest?
Well, I think it's important that people realise what they post on social networks is public. There's a classic analogy that's always used that you shouldn't post anything that you wouldn't be happy to see in the front page of your local paper. So people should know that if you post something, it may well be picked up. But also understanding that it's not a negative and the authorities are there to help, and if you are one of the people who is acting in the right way, then you don't have anything to worry about, and it's not so much of a big brother's watching society, more that everybody trying to work together.
Yeah, and I think these networks have a responsibility to maintain their independence and obviously work with security services where illegal activities happen, but also just make sure that the platforms are as open as possible. Twitter, I think, is a great example of a network that has always been incredibly open, hasn't tried to impose rules on its users, whereas I think Facebook potentially came from a very different position. And we've seen recently with networks like Google+, trying to enforce people to use their real names and all those sorts of things. I think when networks go down that route, I think it can potentially get quite dangerous. So I think the more they can stay open, I think the more users are going to feel happy using them.
And how was the image of BlackBerry affected during the riots?
Well, I think that a lot of people actually aren't aware of BlackBerry Messenger as much as they are as Twitter and Facebook. And I think this has certainly propelled it into the mainstream news, and it's unfortunate that it's in such a negative way. It is like any other social network, and they should take responsibility if it's being used in a negative way, but the same kind of thing stands as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a reputation issue here for BlackBerry potentially. traditionally BlackBerry has been known as the handset of business users, but in recent years they've seen massive sales in much younger demographics, more or less due to the BlackBerry Messenger service that is on the handsets. So again, on the one hand, their association with the riots is obviously a negative thing that they're going to have to manage, but on the other hand, they don't really want to alienate what is now quite an important user base for them. So getting the balance between those two things, I think, is going to be potentially difficult. But it maybe extends back to kind of slightly larger issues within the company in terms of, what do they want to be seen as? Do they want to be seen as a service for business users, or are they keen to sort of open up their handsets to other areas?
And from a, I guess, PR perspective, as we've talked about, there was a lot of negative press around what was happening with Twitter on those days. But I think as well there was some sort of good press when people were using social networking, Twitter and Facebook, to organise and rally themselves together to do clean-up missions and things like that. I mean, is that a good example there of how to use it wisely?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's how the majority were using it as well. There was a great account that was set up to help people keep track of what was happening. People organising cleanups all over the place. That's what social media is about. It's about people coming together, helping each other. I'm sure we've both seen instances when you've needed help with something.
Yeah.
It's usually Twitter that I'd turn to first, and there's always somebody there willing to answer a question that I'm not sure of. And it's a nice demonstration of what social media is about, really, and how it was used.
Yeah, I mean, the channels are there as a service for people to use, and yes, people will use them for activities that we don't agree with, but as Beth said, the vast majority during and after the riots were actually people using these channels to help one another and actually help the communities in which they work with. And that, to me, is the fundamental argument for why these things are good and they should be kept free and independent.
And even, I guess, the police are using social media sites to keep on top of things. Are there any other examples, I guess, of government agencies perhaps using, Twitter and social media sites in this way?
Well, I think what I would like to see is actually security services and the government using these channels more effectively. I think the police were criticised quite early on during the riots for actually not communicating enough with people. And I think what you see in those situations is that people then start spreading rumours and things they've heard but aren't necessarily confirmed. And I think actually if we'd seen the police come out and be a little bit more open in terms of the communication they had on the channel, for example, we might not actually have seen as much of that sort of confusion that existed.
Yeah, and also I think it was actually quite a good opportunity for them to have capitalised on a lot of the positivity that was being discussed around the police, like from both sides as well, because lots of people on social networks were talking about great experiences they'd have with officers in their area, and that's something that, when there was so much negativity in the mainstream press, they could have...
Yeah, and how much better would it be for the government to come out and start praising that stuff rather than coming out and demonising Twitter and BlackBerry Messenger as they've done? And, I just think that's a much more positive way to look at it. And for us, I think that's certainly where our focus would lie.
Some interesting points there. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Danny and Beth. And thank you very much for watching this week's PR Week podcast.